"You're a burden, Michaela." The words came out cold, calculated, like he was discussing a business transaction. Mateo straightened his tie, that gesture she once found endearing but now recognized as armor. "I think you've decided to be a victim instead of fighting this thing." Jennifer Morrison didn't stop living her life. She certainly didn't make her husband's life miserable in the process. Michaela's voice was barely a whisper. "Get out. Michaela. Get out of this kitchen. Get out of this house. Get out." Welcome back to Mr. Ashbourne Golden Narratives, where love stories change lives and hearts find healing. I'm absolutely grateful for each of you amazing subscribers who make this community possible. Your support means everything. Now, let's get back to the story. Michaela Johnson had always believed in fairy tales. Standing in their marble-floored foyer, watching Mateo adjust his silver cufflinks before another charity gala, she felt like she was living one. The woman in the mirror wore designer gowns and diamond earrings, her dark hair swept into elegant updos that cost more than most people's monthly rent. "You look stunning tonight," Mateo would say, his hand resting possessively on her lower back as photographers captured their entrance. The society pages loved them, the successful hedge fund manager and his beautiful wife, a power couple who seemed to have it all. And they did have it all, didn't they? The penthouse overlooking Central Park, the house in the Hamptons, the imported Italian dining table where Michaela would arrange fresh orchids every morning. She had perfected the art of being Mrs. Mateo Blackwell, organizing his social calendar with military precision, hosting dinner parties that left their guests raving for weeks. "Michaela has such an eye for detail," their friends would gush. "You're so lucky, Mateo." He would smile that charming smile that had first captivated her at a gallery opening 8 years ago. "I certainly am," he'd agree, though his eyes were already scanning the room for the next important conversation, the next business opportunity. But in those early days when he was still pursuing her, Mateo had been different. Tentative. Romantic. He'd send flowers to her office with handwritten notes, surprise her with weekend getaways to vineyards, tell her she was the most beautiful woman he'd ever seen. "I want to give you everything," he'd whispered during their second month of dating, his lips against her ear as they danced at a rooftop restaurant. "I want to build a life with you that's worthy of how incredible you are." Michaela had melted into his arms, believing every word. Here was a man who would cherish her, protect her, love her the way she'd always dreamed of being loved. Their wedding had been featured in 3 magazines. 200 guests in a venue that cost more than most people's houses. Michaela's dress had a 12-foot train and required 4 bridesmaids to manage. Mateo had written his own vows, speaking about partnership and devotion while looking into her eyes with what she was certain was genuine love. "Michaela, you are my safe harbor in every storm," he'd said, his voice carrying across the cathedral. "I promise to love you through whatever life brings us. In sickness and in health, in joy and in sorrow, you will never face anything alone." The congregation had sighed collectively. Even the wedding planner had tears in her eyes. But marriage, Michaela discovered, was different from courtship. The romantic gestures faded into routine. The passionate conversations became discussions about household logistics and social obligations. Mateo threw himself into building his empire while Michaela managed the beautiful life they'd created around it. She told herself this was normal. This was how marriages evolved. The butterflies and breathless romance transformed into something deeper, more stable. Partnership. Except when her mother was diagnosed with pancreatic cancer during their 3rd year of marriage, Michaela began to see cracks in that partnership. "I need to be with her," Michaela had told Mateo, standing in their bedroom as she packed a suitcase. The doctor said it could be weeks, maybe days. Mateo was already dressed for work, checking his phone. "Of course. But the Henderson reception is Thursday and we can't both be absent. It would send the wrong message to the clients." "My mother is dying, Mateo." "I understand that." His tone was patient but firm. "But we have responsibilities. Your mother wouldn't want you to jeopardize our reputation." Michaela stared at him, trying to process how he could speak about her mother's death and a cocktail party in the same breath. "She's never even met the Hendersons." "That's not the point." Mateo's jaw tightened slightly. "We're building something here, Michaela. Every decision we make affects our future. I need you to think bigger than just the immediate situation." She went to her mother alone. Held her hand through the final night while Mateo attended the Henderson reception, charming potential clients and maintaining their social standing. When Michaela called to tell him her mother had passed, he was in the middle of closing a major deal. "I'm so sorry, sweetheart," he'd said, though she could hear keyboard clicking in the background. "We'll talk about the arrangements when I get home." This call might determine our entire fourth quarter. Michaela had hung up the phone and cried alone in the hospital chair, her mother's body still warm beside her. That was the moment she should have recognized the pattern. Should have understood that Mateo's love came with conditions, with cost-benefit analyses and careful calculations about what he could afford to feel. But grief has a way of distorting perspective. She told herself he was just focused on providing for them, on building security for their future. She rationalized his absence as dedication rather than abandonment. If you've ever made excuses for someone's inability to show up for you, hit that like button. Sometimes we convince ourselves that love looks different than what our hearts actually need. The years that followed settled into a predictable rhythm. Mateo's business flourished. Their social calendar remained packed. Michaela perfected her role as the charming wife who made everything look effortless. She organized charity events, maintained their homes, cultivated relationships with the wives of Mateo's business associates. From the outside, they were the golden couple everyone envied. Mateo would introduce her at parties with genuine pride in his voice. "This is my wife Michaela. She's the real brains behind everything I do." And Michaela would smile and deflect, the way she'd learned was expected. "Oh, he's just being modest. Mateo is the one with all the talent." But late at night, when the guest had gone home and Mateo was in his study working on deals that would fund their next level of luxury, Michaela would sit at that beautiful Italian dining table and feel profoundly alone. The silence in their house wasn't peaceful, it was hollow. She'd catch herself watching other couples sometimes, the way they touched each other casually, laughed at inside jokes, seemed to exist in a world that included only them. Michaela couldn't remember the last time she and Mateo had shared that kind of intimacy. When she tried to bring it up, Mateo would wave away her concerns with practiced efficiency. "We're not teenagers anymore, Michaela," he'd say, not looking up from his laptop. "Real love isn't about constant romance. It's about building something lasting." And Michaela would nod because it sounded reasonable. It sounded mature. It sounded like what a smart, sophisticated woman should want. She convinced herself that the ache in her chest was just nostalgia for a more innocent time. That the distance between them was normal evolution. That love looked different at their age, with their responsibilities. She had no way of knowing that the real test of their marriage was coming. That the foundation she thought they'd built together was actually something she'd been maintaining alone. The morning she found the lump, Michaela was still operating under the belief that when crisis came, they would face it together. That the man who had promised to love her through whatever life brought would keep that promise. She was about to discover just how much those vows were actually worth. The water was running too hot, steam fogging the glass shower door, but Michaela barely noticed. Her morning routine had become automatic after 8 years of marriage. The same expensive shampoo, the same lavender body wash that Mateo preferred, the same careful attention to maintaining the polished version of herself that the world expected to see. Her fingers moved across her skin in gentle circles, a habit her gynecologist had recommended years ago. Monthly self-examinations, she'd said. Most women forget, but it could save your life someday. Michaela's hands stilled. There was something there. Something that hadn't been there before. Small, hard, unmistakably foreign beneath the familiar landscape of her own body. Her breath caught in her throat as her fingers traced around it, hoping she was wrong, praying it was just her imagination. But it was real. Solid. Undeniable. The shower suddenly felt too small, too hot, too suffocating. Michaela turned off the water with shaking hands and reached for her towel, her mind racing through possibilities. Could be nothing. A cyst. Something benign. Women found lumps all the time and most of them were harmless. She stood in front of the bathroom mirror, water droplets still clinging to her skin, and pressed her fingers to the spot again. Still there. Still wrong. Through the bathroom door, she could hear Mateo moving around their bedroom, getting ready for another day of conquering markets and closing deals. The familiar sounds of his morning routine, the electric toothbrush, the rustle of expensive suits, the beep of his phone checking overnight trading results. She should tell him. Of course she should tell him. They were married. They were partners. This was exactly the kind of thing you shared with your husband. But Michaela found herself hesitating, her hand frozen on the bathroom door handle. Something deep in her chest whispered a warning she didn't want to acknowledge. She remembered his face when her mother got sick, that careful blankness like he was already calculating the emotional cost and finding it too expensive. "Michaela?" Mateo's voice carried a note of impatience. "I need to leave in 10 minutes. Did you remember to call the caterer about the Ashford dinner?" She closed her eyes, took a breath, and opened the door. "I'll call them this morning." Mateo was knotting his tie in front of their dresser mirror, his movements precise and efficient. He looked perfect as always. Not a silver hair out of place, his suit tailored to showcase his still impressive physique at 52. Good. And don't let them convince you to use those cheap flowers again. The Ashfords notice everything. Michaela wrapped her robe tighter around herself. Matteo, I need to. Also, I'll be late tonight. The Tokyo markets are volatile, and I need to stay on top of the overnight trading. He checked his Rolex, a gift she'd given him for their 5th anniversary. Actually, I might stay at the office. No point in driving home just to turn around at 4 a.m. I found something, Michaela said quietly. But Matteo was already moving toward the door, phone in hand, mind clearly on the day ahead. Found what? If it's about the household budget, just handle it. You're good at that stuff. The words died in her throat. Michaela watched her husband disappear down the hallway, heard his footsteps on the marble stairs, listened to the front door close with its expensive, muffled thud. She stood alone in their bedroom, surrounded by the trappings of their perfect life. The silk curtains, the antique furniture, the wedding photos showing two people who looked blissfully happy. The woman in those pictures seemed like a stranger now. Michaela made the appointment herself, calling Dr. Patel's office from her car in the parking garage beneath Matteo's building. She'd driven there intending to go upstairs, to tell him in person what she'd found. But sitting in the elevator, watching the numbers climb toward his floor, something had stopped her. Maybe it was the memory of her mother's final weeks, when Matteo had found urgent reasons to be anywhere else. Maybe it was the growing certainty that this was a battle she'd have to fight alone. Can you come in this afternoon? The nurse asked. Dr. Patel has a cancellation at 3. Michaela looked up at the building where her husband was making money, building his empire, living his life as if nothing in the world had changed. Yes, she said. I'll be there. Dr. Patel was gentle but direct, her hands cool and professional as she examined Michaela in the sterile brightness of her office. The ultrasound machine hummed quietly, its screen showing grainy images that Michaela couldn't interpret but Dr. Patel studied with growing concern. We'll need to do a biopsy, Dr. Patel said finally, pulling off her gloves with careful precision. I want to be clear, this could be nothing. But the size and texture, we need to be thorough. Michaela nodded, her mouth too dry to speak. Is your husband here? I'd like to speak with both of you about the next steps. He's working. The words came out automatically, a reflex born of years of covering for his absences. But I can tell him everything. Dr. Patel's expression softened with something that might have been sympathy. Michaela, whatever this turns out to be, you're going to need support. Please bring him to the next appointment. And please don't wait to tell him. You shouldn't carry this alone. Michaela drove home in a daze, Dr. Patel's words echoing in her mind. The house felt enormous and empty when she walked through the front door. The silence seemed to press against her from all directions, heavy with unspoken fears. She tried to distract herself with the usual tasks, calling the caterer, reviewing seating charts for the Ashford dinner, responding to emails from the charity board. But her hand kept drifting to her chest, to the small, hard secret that was changing everything. Matteo came home at nearly midnight, loose-tied and slightly drunk from client dinners. Michaela was waiting for him at the kitchen island, still in her robe, coffee growing cold in front of her. You're up late, he observed, heading straight for the refrigerator. Everything all right? This was her moment. The opening she'd been waiting for all day. Michaela took a breath, gathering her courage. I went to the doctor today. Matteo emerged from the refrigerator with a bottle of sparkling water, not looking at her. Nothing serious, I hope. We have 3 major events this month, and you know how these people talk if we start canceling. The casual dismissal hit her. I found a lump, Matteo. In my breast. The bottle paused halfway to his lips. For a moment, the kitchen was completely silent except for the hum of expensive appliances. When Matteo finally looked at her, Michaela saw something in his eyes that made her stomach drop. Not concern, not love, not even fear for her well-being. She saw calculation. A man doing complex mathematics in his head, weighing the cost of this development against his carefully planned life. Well, he said finally, setting the bottle on the counter with deliberate control. What did the doctor say? His tone was the same one he used when asking about quarterly reports or market projections. Clinical. Detached. Safe. Michaela felt something inside her begin to crack, though she didn't yet understand what it was. She wants to do a biopsy. She said I shouldn't carry this alone. Christ, Michaela. Matteo ran a hand through his silver hair, and Michaela could practically see him calculating how this would affect their social calendar, their reputation, their carefully constructed life. Why didn't you catch this earlier? Don't you do those self-examinations they're always telling women to do? The question landed like a slap. Michaela stared at her husband, this man who had promised to love her through whatever life brought, and felt the first real crack in the foundation of everything she'd believed about their marriage. If someone's first response to your crisis is to blame you for it, take note. That tells you everything you need to know about who they really are. It wasn't there before, she whispered. These things can develop quickly. Can they? His tone suggested skepticism, as if cancer might be something she'd mismanaged, like a household budget or an overcooked dinner. And in that moment, sitting in their beautiful kitchen with its imported marble and designer fixtures, Michaela began to understand that she was about to face the fight of her life with a man who had already started looking for the exits. The biopsy results came back on a Thursday afternoon, 2 weeks that felt like 2 years after Michaela had first felt that small, hard betrayal beneath her skin. She sat alone in Dr. Patel's office, the afternoon sun streaming through blinds that cast prison bar shadows across the medical diplomas on the wall. Invasive ductal carcinoma, stage 2, Dr. Patel said gently, her hands folded on the desk between them. The good news is that we caught it relatively early. It's treatable, Michaela. Very treatable. Treatable. The word echoed in Michaela's mind as Dr. Patel explained treatment options. Surgery, chemotherapy, radiation. A roadmap through hell that would take the better part of a year to navigate. Where's your husband today? Dr. Patel asked, glancing at the empty chair beside Michaela. Emergency client meeting, Michaela replied automatically, the lie sliding off her tongue with practiced ease. The truth was that Mateo had canceled that morning, citing a critical presentation that couldn't be rescheduled. When Michaela had suggested moving the appointment, he'd looked at her with mild irritation. You can handle this, can't you? You're good with medical stuff. Just get all the information and we'll discuss it tonight. As if cancer was a household repair estimate that could wait for his convenience. Michaela drove home with the diagnosis burning in her chest like acid, the medical pamphlets Dr. Patel had given her sitting on the passenger seat like small, colorful harbingers of doom. The house was empty when she arrived. Mateo wouldn't be home until after 8, assuming he came home at all. She stood in their kitchen, surrounded by the gleaming surfaces of their perfect life, and tried to process the words that would change everything. Cancer. Chemotherapy. Surgery. The concepts felt foreign, impossible, like they belonged to someone else's story. When Mateo finally arrived home, he found Michaela sitting at their dining table, that beautiful Italian piece that had once symbolized their sophisticated taste, with Chinese takeout containers spread before her. You didn't cook? He asked, loosening his tie with the satisfied air of a man who'd had a successful day. I have cancer, Michaela said quietly. Mateo paused in the doorway, his hand still on his tie. For a moment, something flickered across his face, surprise, maybe even concern. But it was gone so quickly Michaela wondered if she'd imagined it. Well, he said, moving to the table and reaching for the lo mein container, what exactly did the doctor say? Michaela watched her husband methodically serve himself noodles while she explained her death sentence. He asked practical questions, timelines, treatment schedules, insurance coverage, as if she were presenting a project plan rather than fighting for her life. So you'll be out of commission for, what, 6 months? He asked, twirling noodles around his chopsticks with careful precision. Out of commission? Michaela felt something cold settle in her stomach. I don't know if that's the right way to put it. I'll be fighting for my life. Mateo set down his chopsticks with a sharp click that echoed through the suddenly silent dining room. Let's not be dramatic, Michaela. You said yourself the doctor thinks it's treatable. Treatable isn't the same as easy. No one said it would be easy. His voice carried that edge of impatience she was becoming too familiar with. But look at Jennifer Morrison. She had breast cancer 3 years ago and she ran the charity auction last month. People manage these things. Jennifer Morrison. Michaela almost laughed at the comparison. Jennifer, whose husband had retired early to care for her full-time. Who'd had a house full of family organizing meal trains and driving her to appointments. Jennifer, who'd never hidden her diagnosis, who'd received hundreds of supportive cards and flowers. But Michaela said none of this. Instead, she began the long, lonely journey into the valley of shadows, carrying the weight of her illness and her husband's indifference in equal measure. The surgery was scheduled for the following Tuesday. Michaela had researched lumpectomies obsessively, reading medical journals and survivor blogs until her eyes burned. She knew exactly what to expect, how long recovery would take, what the scars would look like. What she hadn't prepared for was waking up in the recovery room and seeing Matteo checking his phone instead of her monitors. "How do you feel?" he asked when he noticed her eyes were open, though he didn't look up from his screen. "Tired," Michaela whispered, her throat raw from the breathing tube. "That's normal, right? The anesthesia and all." He glanced at his watch, that anniversary gift that now seemed to mock every moment of tenderness they'd ever shared. "I should probably head back to the office. The markets are closing soon, and there's been some volatility with the tech sector." Michaela watched him gather his coat, kiss her forehead with the brief efficiency of a man checking an item off his to-do list, and disappear through the hospital room door. She timed his visit later, when the nurses weren't bustling around her bed. 47 minutes. 47 minutes to visit his wife after cancer surgery. The flowers he'd brought sat on the bedside table, a generic arrangement from the hospital gift shop, still bearing the price tag he'd forgotten to remove. $24.99 for his wife's cancer surgery. Michaela cried for the first time since her diagnosis, not from physical pain but from a loneliness so profound it felt like drowning. The chemotherapy was harder than surgery, harder than anything Michaela had ever endured. The drugs that were supposed to save her life made her feel like she was dying slowly, one cell at a time. Her hair fell out in clumps, clogging the shower drain like accusations. Her skin turned gray and papery. Food tasted like metal when she could taste anything at all. Matteo's reaction to her transformation was a masterclass in controlled revulsion. He stopped touching her entirely, no casual hand on her shoulder, no kiss goodbye, no unconscious reach for her in bed. He spoke to her in the same tone he used with household staff, polite, distant, efficient. "You should wear the wig when we have people over," he suggested one evening, his voice carefully neutral as he watched her run her hand over her bald scalp. "It looks more normal. As if cancer was a fashion choice she'd made to embarrass him. Michaela started declining social invitations, claiming fatigue. It was easier than watching Matteo's face when friends asked how she was doing, easier than pretending their marriage hadn't become a performance for an audience that was increasingly absent anyway. The breaking point came on a Thursday in November, during Michaela's third month of chemotherapy. She'd woken feeling especially weak, her body aching in ways that defied description. The simple act of showering had left her shaky and nauseous, and making breakfast had been beyond her capabilities entirely. Matteo found her sitting at the kitchen island, head in her hands, untouched coffee growing cold beside her. She looked up when she heard his footsteps, and for a moment she thought she saw something like concern in his eyes. "Michaela?" But his voice carried irritation rather than worry. "I need you to call the caterer about the holiday party. The guest list has changed and Jennifer Morrison is bringing some potential investors. We can't have the same menu as last year." Michaela stared at him, this man she'd married, this man who'd promised to love her through sickness and health. She was barely surviving, barely breathing, and he wanted her to plan a party. "I can't," she whispered. "What?" The word came out stronger this time, surprising them both. "I said I can't. I can barely stand up, Matteo. I can't plan a party right now." His face hardened into that expression she'd learned to dread, the look of a man whose patience was being tested by unreasonable demands. "So what am I supposed to do? Handle everything myself while you?" He gestured vaguely at her, as if her illness were a choice she was making to inconvenience him. The gesture was small, dismissive, but it contained everything Michaela needed to know about who her husband really was. "While I what?" Her voice was steady now, though her hands shook. "While I have cancer. While you use cancer as an excuse to check out of everything that matters." The words hung in the air between them, cruel and clear. Michaela felt something inside her chest crack, not physically but emotionally, a fracture that went deeper than anything the disease had done to her. This was the moment. The conversation that had started everything. The words that would echo in viewers' minds from the very beginning of this story. "You think I'm using this as an excuse?" Matteo straightened his tie, that gesture of armor, of emotional retreat, and Michaela finally understood what she was seeing. "I think you've decided to be a victim instead of fighting this thing. Jennifer Morrison didn't stop living her life. She certainly didn't make her husband's life miserable in the process." The second time he mentioned Jennifer Morrison, Michaela wanted to scream. But instead she felt something cold and final settle in her chest. "Get out. Michaela. Get out of this kitchen. Get out of this house. Get out." Matteo left for work without another word, and Michaela sat alone in their beautiful kitchen, finally understanding that sometimes the most dangerous cancer isn't the one growing in your body, it's the one you've been married to all along. That night, Matteo didn't come home. Michaela sat in their kitchen until well past midnight, listening to the silence that had become her closest companion. The house felt different now, charged with the electricity of words that couldn't be taken back. "You're a burden." The phrase echoed through the empty rooms like a curse. She made herself tea with shaking hands, the simple act of boiling water requiring more energy than she seemed to possess. The chemotherapy had hollowed her out from the inside, leaving her feeling like a ghost haunting her own life. But it was Matteo's words, not the cancer, that made her feel truly dead inside. When he finally returned the next evening, Michaela heard him moving around upstairs in what used to be their shared space. The sound of drawers opening and closing, hangers sliding across closet rods, the dull thud of suitcases being packed. She didn't go upstairs to watch him dismantle their marriage one expensive shirt at a time. Instead, she sat at that Italian dining table and stared at her reflection in its polished surface, wondering when she'd become someone her own husband could abandon so easily. Matteo appeared in the kitchen doorway 3 days later, looking like a man who'd been staying in hotels and eating restaurant meals. His usually perfect appearance was slightly rumpled, his tie askew in a way that once would have endeared him to her. Now it just looked like the costume of a man playing a role he was tired of performing. "I've been thinking," he said, standing in their living room like a stranger delivering bad news. His voice had that careful, rehearsed quality she recognized from his business presentations. Michaela pulled her robe tighter around her diminished frame and waited. She knew what was coming. Had known, if she was honest, from the moment he'd first looked at her with calculation instead of love. "This isn't working," Matteo continued, his hands clasped behind his back in a posture of authority. "You're sick and I'm not equipped to handle sick. I'm not built for this kind of thing, Michaela. I never pretended to be. Handle sick." As if she were a malfunctioning appliance rather than the woman he'd promised to love for better or worse. "I'm your wife," Michaela said quietly, her voice steady despite the earthquake happening inside her chest. Matteo's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. "You're a burden." There it was again. That word that had started this avalanche. But this time, he said it with the cold finality of a business decision that had already been made. "I know that sounds harsh," he continued, as if acknowledging cruelty could somehow soften its impact, "but it's honest. This whole thing, the treatments, the mood swings, the way you look now, it's more than I signed up for. I married a healthy, vibrant woman who could be a partner in building the life I wanted." He gestured at her with the same dismissive wave he'd used before, but now it carried the weight of a final judgment. "This." He paused, searching for words that would cut deepest. "This isn't what I agreed to." Michaela stared at this man she'd loved for 8 years, who'd promised in front of 200 guests to love her in sickness and in health. She thought of all the times she'd supported him, through his father's death when he'd needed her to handle every detail of the funeral because grief made him ineffective. Through the scandal at his firm when rumors of insider trading had threatened his reputation and she'd stood by him, attending every social function with her head held high, deflecting questions with grace and loyalty. She thought of his mother's slow descent into dementia, how Michaela had been the one to research care facilities, coordinate with doctors, and hold his hand through the difficult decision to move her to memory care. Matteo had been too emotional to handle those conversations himself. She thought of the woman she'd been before cancer, the woman who'd organized his social life, managed his household, never asked for anything more complicated than his presence. And now that she needed him, truly needed him, he was itemizing her deficiencies like a failed investment. "So you're leaving," she said. It wasn't a question. "I'm leaving." Matteo picked up a folder from the coffee table. When had he put that there? How long had he been planning this exit strategy? "My lawyer drew up papers. The house is yours, obviously, and I've arranged for continued health insurance. The settlement is generous." Generous? As if money could compensate for abandonment, as if financial security could fill the space where love used to be. Michaela almost laughed at the word. How generous of him to provide health insurance for the wife he was abandoning during her fight with cancer. "I'll need you to sign these within the week," Matteo continued, his tone purely businesslike now. "My attorney says we can have everything finalized within 60 days if there are no complications." Complications? Like Michaela's cancer treatment schedule. Like the fact that she was fighting for her life while he was fighting to escape the inconvenience of her mortality. Michaela looked down at the folder, thick with legal documents that would dissolve 8 years of marriage as efficiently as Matteo dissolved unprofitable business partnerships. She thought about the wedding photos upstairs, the promises they'd made, the life they'd built that had apparently been as fragile as her own health. "The Hartman's anniversary party is next weekend," Matteo said, straightening his already straight tie. I'll be going alone, obviously. I've told people you're still recovering from a minor procedure. No need to make this more complicated than it has to be. More complicated. Michaela realized that even her cancer had been inconvenient timing for Matteo. Too messy for their social calendar. Too real for their carefully curated image. Matteo walked toward the door, then paused with his hand on the brass handle they'd chosen together during their first year of marriage. For a moment, Michaela thought he might say something human. Something that acknowledged what they'd once meant to each other. For what it's worth, he said without turning around, I hope you beat this thing. I really do. No, you don't, Michaela said quietly. You hope you never have to think about it again. Matteo's shoulders tensed slightly, but he didn't deny it. He walked out of their house, out of their marriage, out of her life, with the same efficiency he brought to every business transaction. Michaela sat alone in the living room they'd decorated together, surrounded by the artifacts of a love that had apparently been conditional all along. The antique clock on the mantel ticked away the seconds of her new reality. Divorced, sick, alone. She thought about calling someone, her sister in California maybe, or her college roommate who still sent Christmas cards. But the effort of explaining everything, of admitting how completely her life had collapsed, felt impossible. How do you tell people that your husband left you because cancer made you inconvenient? Michaela picked up the legal papers with hands that barely shook anymore. The shock was wearing off, leaving behind something harder and colder. The documents were thorough, professional, and utterly devoid of emotion. Matteo had reduced their entire relationship to financial calculations and asset divisions. She found herself thinking about Jennifer Morrison again, the woman Matteo had thrown in her face like an accusation. Jennifer, whose husband had held her hand through every treatment, who'd shaved his own head in solidarity when she lost her hair, who'd turned their garage into a recovery room so she wouldn't have to climb stairs during her worst days. Michaela had always envied other women their wardrobes, their vacations, their careers. She'd never thought to envy them their husband's capacity for love. The house felt enormous around her as she sat there in her robe, legal papers scattered across the coffee table like the debris of her former life. Every room held memories of the woman she used to be, the woman who'd believed that love was enough, that marriage meant partnership, that in sickness and in health, were more than just pretty words spoken in front of witnesses. But as Michaela sat there in the ruins of everything she'd thought she wanted, something unexpected began to stir in her chest. Not hope, not yet, but something harder and more durable. A tiny flame of anger that had nothing to do with self-pity and everything to do with self-preservation. Matteo had called her a burden, had abandoned her when she needed him most, had reduced their marriage to a cost-benefit analysis. But he'd also given her something valuable, even if he hadn't meant to, the truth about who he really was. And maybe, Michaela thought as she looked around the house that would soon be hers alone, it was time to discover who she really was too. For the first time in months, Michaela didn't feel like crying. She felt like fighting. Not just against the cancer eating away at her body, but against the lies she'd been telling herself about what love was supposed to look like. Matteo was gone. But Michaela was still here. And that, she was beginning to realize, might be the best thing that could have happened to either of them. Michaela signed the divorce papers on a Tuesday morning, her signature looking foreign and shaky on the crisp legal documents. She dropped them at Matteo's attorney's office herself, driving through the city in her pajamas and a baseball cap pulled low over her bald head. The receptionist's carefully neutral expression told Michaela everything she needed to know about how she looked, like a woman coming apart at the seams. But driving home, something unexpected happened. Instead of the crushing weight she'd been carrying for months, Michaela felt lighter. The papers were signed. The pretense was over. Matteo was gone and she was still here. She had 4 more months of chemotherapy ahead of her. 4 more months of poison dripping into her veins every 2 weeks, of nausea that made breathing feel like work, of fatigue so profound it felt like drowning. But for the first time since her diagnosis, she wouldn't have to manage anyone else's discomfort with her illness. The difference was remarkable. Michaela drove herself to every appointment, parking in the cancer center's garage and walking through the automatic doors without having to worry about someone checking their watch or sighing impatiently. She brought books, novels Matteo had always dismissed as commercial fiction, and lost herself in other people's stories while the chemo dripped steadily into her port. "How are you feeling today, Michaela?" asked Nancy, her favorite nurse, a woman in her 50s with laugh lines and gentle hands. "Tired," Michaela replied honestly. "But peaceful, I think." Nancy glanced at the empty chair beside Michaela's recliner, the chair that had always been empty during her treatments. Your husband's still working? We're divorced, Michaela said, the words feeling strange in her mouth. Well, divorcing. Nancy's expression didn't change, but she adjusted Michaela's blanket with extra care. Sometimes, she said quietly, crisis shows us who people really are. The good news is, it shows us who we really are too. It was Nancy who first mentioned the support group. Thursday nights at 7, she said, pressing a flyer into Michaela's hands. Dr. Johnson runs it. She's a breast cancer survivor herself, 15 years out. Wonderful woman. Michaela almost threw the flyer away. The last thing she wanted was to sit in a circle with other sick women, sharing stories about how cancer had destroyed their lives. But something about Nancy's expression stopped her. I know what you're thinking, Nancy said with a small smile. But trust me, these women, they'll surprise you. The community center where the support group met looked exactly like Michaela had expected. Fluorescent lights, folding chairs arranged in a circle, the smell of coffee and industrial carpet cleaner. She almost turned around 3 times before finally pushing through the glass doors. Dr. Johnson was nothing like Michaela had imagined. She was younger, maybe early 40s, with shoulder-length dark hair and the kind of energy that filled a room. Her laugh was infectious, and when she hugged Michaela, actually hugged her like they were old friends, Michaela felt something she hadn't experienced in months, human warmth without pity. Ladies, Dr. Johnson announced to the group, we have someone new joining us tonight. Michaela, would you like to introduce yourself? Michaela looked around the circle at 8 other women, ranging in age from what looked like late 20s to mid-70s. Some wore wigs, some were bald, some had the soft fuzz of hair growing back. All of them were looking at her with expressions of understanding that had nothing to do with sympathy and everything to do with recognition. I'm Michaela, she said quietly. I was diagnosed with breast cancer 3 months ago. Stage 2. I'm going through chemotherapy. How's your support system? Asked a woman named Chloe, probably in her 40s with a colorful headscarf wrapped expertly around her head. Michaela hesitated. My husband and I are divorcing. The reaction wasn't what she expected. No gasps of shock, no expressions of pity. Just nods of understanding that somehow hurt worse than surprise would have. Mine filed papers during my 2nd round of chemo, Chloe said matter-of-factly. Apparently, bald wives don't photograph well at business dinners. Mine stayed, added Maria, an older woman with kind eyes, but he made it clear every day that my cancer was an inconvenience to his retirement plans. Sometimes leaving is more honest than staying and making you feel guilty for being sick. The thing about crisis, Dr. Johnson said gently, is it strips away all the pretense. People show you exactly who they are when things get difficult. That's not a character flaw on your part, Michaela. That's information. Michaela felt something loosening in her chest, some knot of shame she hadn't even realized she'd been carrying. She'd spent months thinking there was something wrong with her, some failure on her part that had made Mateo unable to love her through this. But looking around this circle of women who understood exactly what she'd been through, Michaela began to wonder if the failure had been his, not hers. Real love doesn't abandon you when you need it most, it shows up stronger. If you've ever been made to feel like your struggles were too much for someone to handle, that says everything about them and nothing about you. It like if you needed to hear this today. Over the following weeks, Michaela found herself looking forward to Thursday nights in ways that surprised her. These women became her anchors, her witnesses, her proof that survival was possible. They shared practical advice about managing nausea, dealing with chemo brain, and finding wigs that didn't make you look like you were wearing a dead animal. But more than that, they shared stories of discovery. Of learning who they were when stripped of everything they thought defined them. Of finding strength in places they'd never thought to look. I used to think I needed my husband to feel safe, Chloe told the group one evening. Turns out, the most unsafe I ever felt was being married to someone who could abandon me when I got sick. Michaela nodded, understanding exactly what she meant. The constant anxiety of trying to manage Mateo's comfort with her illness had been more exhausting than the cancer itself. At home, Michaela began to experiment with solitude in ways she never had before. She slept when she was tired without apologizing. She ate ice cream for dinner when solid food felt impossible, without worrying about setting a bad example. She watched foreign films with subtitles, documentaries about subjects that fascinated her, romantic comedies that made her cry for reasons that had nothing to do with cancer. She discovered that she liked quiet mornings with tea and books. That she preferred showers to baths, cats to dogs, when she was well enough to think about getting a pet, and jazz to classical music. Small things, maybe, but they felt like archaeology, digging up pieces of herself that had been buried under years of being the woman Mateo needed her to be. The chemo was still brutal. Some days, Michaela felt like she was drowning in her own body. But without the additional weight of someone else's disappointment in her illness, the burden felt manageable, survivable. On the days when she felt strong enough, Michaela began taking walks around her neighborhood. Just short ones at first, to the corner and back. But gradually she expanded her route, noticing things she'd never seen despite living there for 5 years. The way morning light fell across certain porches. The sound of children playing in backyards. The elderly man who tended his roses with the care of someone who understood that beautiful things required patience. Michaela was learning patience too. With her body's limitations, with her emotional healing, with the slow process of chemotherapy doing its work. She was learning that recovery wasn't just about eliminating cancer cells, it was about rebuilding yourself from the ground up. And for the first time since her diagnosis, Michaela felt like the person emerging from this process might be someone she actually wanted to know. Michaela finished her last chemotherapy treatment on a crisp day in February, 8 months after that Tuesday morning when everything changed. She sat in the familiar recliner, watching the final drops of medicine flow through the 4-line, and felt something she hadn't experienced in almost a year: hope. Scary, Michaela admitted. And wonderful. Is that normal? Completely normal. You've been in fight mode for so long, your body doesn't quite know what to do with the idea of healing. Nancy squeezed her shoulder. Give yourself time to adjust. And Michaela? You should be proud of yourself. You did this. Michaela drove home slowly, savoring the word. Done. She was done with chemotherapy. Her latest scans had shown no evidence of disease. The cancer was gone, and slowly her body was starting to remember how to be healthy again. The house felt different when she walked through the front door. It was still the same space where Mateo had called her a burden, where he'd abandoned her when she needed him most. But it was also the place where she'd learned to be alone without being lonely, where she'd discovered that she was stronger than she'd ever imagined. Michaela had made a decision during her final weeks of treatment. She was going to sell this house with its marble floors and imported furniture, its memories of a marriage that had been built on shallow foundations. She wanted something smaller, something that felt like home rather than a showplace. The realtor she'd hired was optimistic about the sale. Prime location, beautiful finishes, she'd said, walking through the rooms with professional enthusiasm. We should have no trouble finding buyers. Michaela hoped so. She'd already found the place she wanted to move to, a small cottage near the ocean about an hour outside the city. It had a garden that was currently overgrown with weeds, but Michaela could see its potential. She'd spent her recovery weeks reading about vegetables and flowers, learning about soil and seasons, dreaming about growing things with her own hands. The cottage was modest compared to what she was leaving behind, but it had something this house never had. It felt like peace. Michaela was standing in her kitchen, looking out at the yard where she'd never planted anything because Mateo preferred clean lines to the chaos of gardens, when she noticed her neighbor working in his own backyard. She'd seen him before, of course. David Jones lived in the house next door, a quiet man who seemed to be around her age, maybe a few years older. He'd moved in about 2 years ago, after the elderly couple who'd lived there since Michaela and Mateo had bought their place. Michaela had always meant to introduce herself properly, but Mateo had discouraged neighborly relationships. Too much drama, he'd said. People always want to borrow things or ask favors. Better to keep it professional. But watching David work in his garden, Michaela felt a pull she hadn't experienced in months. Not romantic attraction. She wasn't ready for that, might never be ready for that again. Just curiosity. The desire for human connection that didn't involve medical appointments or support groups. David was kneeling beside a raised bed, his hands gentle as he transplanted seedlings. There was something peaceful about the way he moved, deliberate but not rushed. Michaela found herself watching longer than she should have, noting the care he took with each small plant, the way he seemed to be having quiet conversations with his tomatoes. When David looked up and caught her watching, Michaela's first instinct was to step away from the window. But something made her stay. David smiled, not the practiced charm she'd grown accustomed to with Mateo's business associates, but something genuine and warm. He raised a dirt-covered hand in greeting. Michaela found herself smiling back and waving, feeling suddenly foolish in her pajamas and knit cap. But David's expression didn't change, didn't register judgment or pity or the careful politeness people used when they didn't know how to react to cancer. The next morning, Michaela was sitting on her back porch with coffee and a book, a luxury she'd learned to appreciate during her recovery, when she heard a gentle knock at her gate. David stood on the other side of the fence that separated their yards, holding a small potted plant in his hands. Up close, Michaela could see that he had kind eyes behind wire-rimmed glasses, and the sort of gentle demeanor that immediately put her at ease. "I hope I'm not bothering you," he said, his voice carrying a slight accent that Michaela couldn't place. "I'm David. From next door." "Michaela," she replied, setting down her book. "And you're not bothering me at all. I noticed you were watching me garden yesterday and I thought, well, I have more basil seedlings than I know what to do with. Would you like one?" Michaela looked at the small plant in his hands, its green leaves bright with morning dew. "I don't really know anything about gardening," she admitted. "Basil is forgiving," David said with a smile. "And if you kill it, I have plenty more." There was something about his tone, gentle humor without mockery, that made Michaela laugh for the first time in weeks. "In that case, I'd love it." David handed the plant through the gate, and Michaela noticed that his hands were scarred in places, marked by years of working in soil and sun. "Are you the one selling the house?" he asked. "I am." "How did you know?" "The sign went up this morning." "Are you moving far?" Michaela found herself wanting to tell him about the cottage, about her dreams of learning to grow things, about starting over in a place that held no memories of who she used to be. But they were strangers and she'd learned to be careful with personal information. "About an hour from here," she said instead. "Closer to the ocean." "That sounds wonderful," David said, and Michaela could tell he meant it. "Will you miss the city?" Michaela looked around at the manicured yard, the perfectly maintained exterior of the house that had never really felt like home. "No," she said honestly. "I don't think I will." David nodded as if he understood exactly what she meant. "Well, if you need any help with the basil, I'm usually in the garden around this time most mornings. Feel free to ask." After he left, Michaela sat on her porch holding the small plant and feeling oddly moved by the simple kindness of the gesture. When was the last time someone had given her something just because they thought she might enjoy it? Not because it was expected, not because it served some social or business purpose, but simply because they wanted to share something they loved? She couldn't remember. Michaela placed the basil on her kitchen windowsill and spent the morning researching how to care for it. She learned about watering schedules and sunlight requirements, about pinching back flowers to encourage leaf growth, about harvesting techniques that would keep the plant healthy. It was such a small thing, this little plant with its aromatic leaves. But as Michaela read about basil cultivation, she felt something stirring that had nothing to do with romance and everything to do with possibility. The possibility of nurturing something, of watching it grow, of being responsible for life in the most fundamental way. Sometimes the smallest acts of kindness plant the biggest seeds of hope. A neighbor's simple gesture can remind you that there are still people in the world who give without expecting anything in return. Comment below about a small kindness that changed your day. Over the following days, Michaela found herself looking forward to her morning coffee on the porch, partly because she enjoyed the quiet ritual, but also because she might catch a glimpse of David in his garden. He was always doing something, planting, weeding, watering, harvesting. His movements had a meditative quality that Michaela found soothing to watch. Sometimes they would wave to each other. Sometimes David would hold up a tomato or a handful of lettuce, showing off his garden's progress like a proud parent. Michaela began to understand that gardening wasn't just about growing food for David, it was about creating life, nurturing growth, participating in something larger than himself. It was exactly the kind of relationship Michaela needed. No pressure, no expectations, just the gentle acknowledgement of shared space and mutual respect. David never asked her personal questions, never stared at her knit caps or commented on her obvious illness. He simply treated her like a neighbor, like a person, like someone whose company he enjoyed without needing to understand her story. For a woman learning to trust again, learning to believe that kindness could exist without conditions, David's steady presence felt like a gift she hadn't known she needed. The basil plant thrived under Michaela's careful attention, growing lush and fragrant on her kitchen windowsill. She found herself checking on it multiple times a day, marveling at how something so small could bring such disproportionate joy. When she finally worked up the courage to harvest her first few leaves for a simple pasta dish, the sense of accomplishment was overwhelming. "How's your basil doing?" David asked one morning as Michaela sat on her porch with coffee, the familiar ritual that had become the brightest part of her day. "Growing," Michaela replied, holding up the small sprig she'd picked that morning. "I made pesto yesterday. First time I've cooked anything more complicated than soup in months." David's face lit up with genuine pleasure. "That's wonderful. There's something special about eating food you've grown yourself, isn't there?" Michaela nodded, surprised by how much she wanted to share this small victory with him. It feels like magic almost, that something I tended could become something nourishing. That's exactly what it is, David said, leaning against the fence that separated their yards. Magic. Most people don't understand that about gardening. They think it's just about the vegetables or flowers, but really it's about participating in life itself. There was something in his voice, a depth that suggested he understood magic and loss in equal measure. Michaela found herself curious about his story, though she'd learned to appreciate how he never pressured her to share hers. Have you always been a gardener? She asked. David's expression grew thoughtful. My wife taught me, he said quietly. She had the most incredible touch with plants. Could make anything grow anywhere. I was skeptical at first, seemed like a lot of work for a few tomatoes I could buy at the store. Was that? Michaela caught the past tense and felt her heart contract with recognition. What changed your mind? Watching her face when she worked in the soil, David said, his voice soft with memory. She was happiest in the garden. And after she... He paused, gathering himself. After she died, it was the closest I could get to her. Every plant I grow feels like a conversation we're still having. Michaela felt tears prick her eyes, not from sadness but from the beauty of someone loving so completely that even loss couldn't diminish it. How long has it been? 3 years in October, David replied. Cancer. The word hung between them, heavy with understanding. Michaela felt something shift in her chest, a recognition that went deeper than shared experience. David wasn't just being kind to a neighbor, he was someone who understood what it meant to watch cancer take everything precious away. I'm sorry, Michaela said, meaning it in a way that went beyond polite condolences. Thank you. David's smile was sad but genuine. She would have loved you, I think. She always said the best conversations happened over garden fences. Over the following weeks, those fence conversations became the anchor of Michaela's days. David never asked intrusive questions about her illness, never offered unsolicited advice or false optimism. Instead, he shared stories about his garden, asked her opinion on where to plant his fall vegetables, brought her surplus zucchini and cherry tomatoes with the sheepish admission that his wife had always been better at controlling the more enthusiastic plants. Michaela found herself looking forward to these exchanges with an intensity that surprised her. David's presence in her daily routine felt like sunlight after a long winter. Gentle, warming, life-giving in ways she was only beginning to understand. When a stomach bug left Michaela weak and nauseous for several days, a reminder that her body was still recovering from months of chemotherapy, she didn't appear for their usual morning chat. On the third day, she woke to find a container of homemade soup sitting by her back door, still warm, with a note in David's careful handwriting, chicken and rice. My wife's recipe for when the world feels too much. No need to thank me, just get well. Michaela sat on her kitchen floor and cried, not from sadness but from the overwhelming experience of being cared for without conditions, without expectations, without being made to feel like a burden for needing help. Thank you for the soup, Michaela said when she finally felt well enough to venture onto her porch again. It was exactly what I needed. David looked up from where he was harvesting late summer tomatoes, his face brightening at the sight of her. You look better. I was worried. The simple admission that he'd been worried about her hit Michaela with unexpected force. When was the last time someone had worried about her health because they cared about her well-being, not because her illness inconvenienced them? I'm okay, she said. Still learning that recovery isn't linear. No, David agreed, his voice gentle with understanding. It's not. Some days you feel like you're healing and other days it feels like you're starting over. But the important thing is that you keep going. Michaela studied his face, seeing something there that she recognized, the particular exhaustion that came from watching someone you love suffer, the relief and guilt that followed their peace, the long work of rebuilding a life around absence. You took care of her, didn't you? During her illness. David nodded, his hands still busy among the tomato vines. For 2 years. It was the hardest and most important thing I've ever done. Were you scared? Michaela asked, surprised by her own boldness. Terrified, David replied without hesitation. Every day. But not of the work, not of the caregiving. I was scared of not being enough, of not giving her everything she deserved. Scared of the day when loving her wouldn't be enough to keep her here. Michaela felt something break open in her chest, some long-held knot of shame finally loosening. Here was a man who had loved someone through the worst imaginable circumstances, who had stayed and fought and cared without counting the cost. The contrast with Mateo was so stark it left her breathless. You were enough, she said quietly. The fact that you stayed, that you loved her through it all, that was everything. David's hands stilled among the tomatoes, and when he looked at her, his eyes were bright with unshed tears. "Thank you," he said simply. "I needed to hear that." As summer faded into autumn, Michaela's house sold faster than anyone had expected. The new buyers were eager to close quickly, which meant she'd be moving to her cottage by the ocean in just 6 weeks. The prospect excited her. She was ready for her new life, ready for the peace and possibility of starting over. But the thought of leaving David's steady presence, their morning conversations, the gentle rhythm of shared solitude, left her with an ache she hadn't anticipated. "I'm going to miss our talks," she told him one morning as they stood on opposite sides of the fence, both wrapped in sweaters against the growing chill. "Me too," David replied, his voice soft. "It's been healing having someone who understands." Michaela felt her pulse quicken at the word. Healing. That's what this had been, wasn't it? Not just friendship but mutual healing. Two people who had been broken by love and loss, finding in each other's company a reminder that gentleness still existed in the world. "The cottage I'm buying," Michaela found herself saying, "it has a big garden. Completely overgrown right now, but the bones are good. I was thinking, if you ever wanted to visit to see what I managed to grow." David's smile was like sunrise. "I'd love that. I could bring some of Linda's bulbs, daffodils and tulips she planted before she got sick. They come back every year and I think she'd like knowing they were helping another garden grow." Michaela felt tears slip down her cheeks, overwhelmed by the generosity of the offer, by the way David could honor his wife's memory while still opening his heart to new possibilities. "That would be beautiful," she whispered. Standing there in the autumn morning, separated by a fence but connected by understanding deeper than romance, Michaela realized that healing could take many forms. David wasn't offering to fix her or complete her or save her from loneliness. He was offering to share the quiet work of rebuilding, the patient process of learning to trust life again. And for the first time since Mateo had called her a burden and walked away, Michaela felt ready to believe that she was worthy of that kind of love. The kind that showed up not because it had to, but because it wanted to. The kind that stayed not out of obligation but out of choice. The kind that saw strength in scars and beauty in survival. The kind of love that healed instead of harmed, that built instead of tore down, that whispered, "You are enough," instead of cataloging all the ways you fell short. Michaela was finally ready to learn what real love felt like. Michaela was packing books in her living room when her phone rang on a Thursday afternoon in late October. The caller ID made her freeze. Mateo? She hadn't heard from him since the divorce papers were finalized 4 months ago, hadn't seen him since that terrible morning when he'd called her a burden and walked out of her life. She almost didn't answer. Almost let it go to voicemail and continued with the peaceful work of dismantling the life they'd built together. But curiosity won out. "Hello, Mateo." "Michaela." His voice sounded different, less certain, less commanding than she remembered. "How are you?" The question was so absurd that Michaela almost laughed. How was she? She was alive. She was healthy. She was stronger than she'd ever been. She was 3 days away from moving to a cottage by the ocean where she planned to grow vegetables and flowers and maybe, just maybe, learn what it felt like to be truly happy. "I'm well," she said simply. "I heard about the house. Sold quickly." Michaela wondered who had told him, then realized it didn't matter. Their social circles had overlapped for 8 years. News traveled fast in their world. It did. "Michaela, Mateo paused, and she could hear him gathering himself for what was clearly a rehearsed speech. "I've been thinking a lot about us. About what happened." Michaela said nothing, letting the silence stretch between them. "I made a mistake," Mateo continued. "I was scared and I handled everything badly. You were sick and instead of supporting you, I let my own fears take over." Michaela moved to her window, looking out at David's garden where he was carefully covering his tender plants against the coming frost. Even from a distance, she could see the care he took with each covering, the way he spoke quietly to his plants as he worked. "I've been seeing someone," Mateo continued when Michaela didn't respond. "A therapist. She's helped me understand that I have issues with handling crisis. With emotional availability." A therapist. Michaela wondered if this was part of Mateo's campaign to win her back, demonstrating his commitment to change, his willingness to work on himself. It was exactly the kind of strategic thinking that had made him successful in business and utterly failing at love. "That's good, Mateo," Michaela said, her voice neutral. "Everyone should have someone to talk to." "The thing is," Mateo pressed on, "I realize now that what we had was special. That I threw away something real because I was too immature to handle adversity. And I'd like to try again. If you're willing. Michaela closed her eyes, trying to summon any feeling about this man who had once been the center of her world. Anger, hurt, even nostalgic affection. But there was nothing there except a kind of distant pity. I don't think that's a good idea, she said quietly. Michaela, please. I know I hurt you. I know I failed you when you needed me most. But I've changed. I'm getting help. We could start over, do it right this time. Start over. As if 8 years of marriage and a devastating betrayal could be erased with therapy sessions and good intentions. As if her cancer had been a test they'd failed the first time but could retake with better preparation. Mateo, Michaela said gently, I don't think you understand. I don't want to start over with you. I don't want to try again. Is there someone else? The question came out sharper than he'd probably intended, and Michaela heard the old Mateo underneath the reformed one, the man who thought in terms of competition and acquisition. Michaela looked out at David again, watching him work with the patient devotion of someone who understood that love was daily practice, not grand gesture. Yes, she said. There is. The silence on the other end of the line stretched so long that Michaela wondered if Mateo had hung up. Who? He finally asked. That's not really your concern anymore. Michaela, be reasonable. Whoever this guy is, he's taking advantage of you while you're vulnerable. You're not thinking clearly. And there it was. The assumption that Michaela couldn't possibly make good decisions about her own life, that any choice that didn't include him must be evidence of impaired judgment. The same condescension that had colored their entire marriage, disguised as concern. I'm thinking more clearly than I ever have, Michaela replied. And I'm not vulnerable, Mateo. I'm strong. Stronger than I was when we were married. You don't mean that. I absolutely mean that. You leaving was the best thing that ever happened to me. Michaela heard Mateo's sharp intake of breath, and for a moment she felt sorry for him. Not enough to change her mind, but enough to soften her tone. Mateo, I hope therapy helps you. I hope you find someone who loves you the way you need to be loved. But that person isn't me. Not anymore. Michaela. Goodbye, Mateo. Michaela hung up the phone and stood in her half-packed living room, feeling lighter than she had in months. The conversation that had once seemed impossible, rejecting Mateo, choosing herself over the safety of familiar dysfunction, had been surprisingly easy. She was still standing by the window when she saw David's face appear over the fence, his expression concerned. Everything all right? He called softly. You looked upset. Michaela grabbed her jacket and stepped outside, needing the cool air and David's steady presence. My ex-husband called, she said, joining him at the fence. He wants to reconcile. David's hand stilled on the plant covering he was adjusting. How do you feel about that? Michaela appreciated that he asked about her feelings rather than offering his opinion. It was such a small thing, but it represented everything she'd learned about the difference between real support and controlling concern. Sad for him, I think, Michaela said honestly. But not tempted. Not even a little bit. Because of us? David asked quietly. Michaela studied his face, this gentle man who had shown her what it looked like to love without conditions, to care without trying to control, to support without keeping score. Because of me, she said. Because I finally understand what I deserve. What love should actually look like. David's smile was soft and understanding. And what does it look like? Michaela thought about Mateo's phone call, his attempt to reclaim her now that she was healthy and valuable again. Then she thought about David bringing her soup when she was sick, sharing stories about his wife, offering his presence without asking for anything in return. It looks like someone who sees your scars as proof of your courage, not evidence of damage, Michaela said. Someone who shows up when you're at your worst, not just when you're convenient to love. It looks like choice, Michaela continued, not obligation. Like partnership, not possession. Like someone who waters your garden instead of demanding you make theirs bloom. David reached through the fence and took her hand, his fingers warm and calloused from honest work. Michaela, he said quietly, would you like to have dinner with me? Not as neighbors, not as friends, but as more than that. Michaela felt her heart flutter with something she'd almost forgotten existed. Excitement about the future, about possibility, about love that felt safe instead of dangerous. I'd love that, she whispered. Standing there in the autumn evening, their hands linked through the fence that had brought them together, Michaela understood that sometimes the best thing that can happen to you is having everything you thought you wanted fall apart. Because only then can you discover what you actually need. And what Michaela needed wasn't someone who would love her despite her flaws, but someone who would love her because of them. Not someone who would save her, but someone who would stand beside her while she saved herself. She'd found that someone, and his name was David. 1 year later, Michaela stood in her cottage garden at dawn, watching the sunrise paint everything golden. The overgrown wilderness she'd purchased had been transformed into something that felt like paradise. Raised beds bursting with tomatoes and basil, flower borders alive with color, pathways lined with the daffodils and tulips that David had transplanted from Linda's garden. "The flowers are perfect," Chloe said, arriving with Maria and Dr. Johnson, Michaela's chosen family, carrying armloads of wildflowers they'd picked from the meadow beyond the cottage. "Linda would be so happy to see them blooming here." Michaela touched one of the tulip petals gently. David had been right. There was something magical about flowers that carried love from one garden to another, one life to another. They were Linda's gift to Michaela's new beginning, a blessing from a woman she'd never met but felt connected to through David's stories. "Are you nervous?" Maria asked as they arranged the flowers in simple mason jars around the garden. Michaela considered the question. Tomorrow she would marry David in this garden they'd built together, surrounded by 20 of their closest friends. No society photographers, no imported decorations, no performance for people who cared more about the spectacle than the love being celebrated. "No," Michaela said, surprised by how true it was. "I'm not nervous at all." The past year had been a revelation. Moving to the cottage, creating a life shaped by her own desires rather than someone else's expectations, had shown Michaela parts of herself she'd never known existed. She loved the physical work of gardening, the satisfaction of growing her own food, the peace of mornings spent with coffee and books on her porch overlooking the ocean. David had become a constant presence in that new life, driving out every weekend, then every few days until it seemed natural for him to simply stay. His own house remained empty while he helped Michaela build raised beds and plant fruit trees, while they cooked together in her tiny kitchen and fell asleep to the sound of waves. "I've been thinking," David had said one evening in spring as they sat on her porch watching the sunset, "about selling my place in the city." "Oh." Michaela had tried to keep her voice casual, though her heart was racing. "It doesn't feel like home anymore." "This does." He gestured around the garden, but his eyes were on Michaela. "You do." The proposal had come naturally, organically, like everything else between them. They were transplanting tomato seedlings on a warm June morning when David paused in his work. "Michaela," he'd said quietly, "I want to spend the rest of my life helping things grow with you. Will you marry me?" Michaela had said yes with dirt under her fingernails and tears on her cheeks, and it had been the most romantic moment of her life. Now, as her friends finished decorating the garden with flowers and lights, Michaela felt the deep contentment of someone who had fought for her happiness and won. The scars from her surgery were barely visible now, but more importantly, they no longer made her feel broken. They were proof of her strength, evidence of a battle she'd survived and overcome. "Michaela," Dr. Johnson said softly, approaching with something wrapped in tissue paper. "The support group wanted you to have this." Michaela unwrapped a small ceramic plaque with words painted in elegant script. She believed she could, so she did. "It's for your garden," Dr. Johnson explained. "A reminder that you didn't just survive, you bloomed." As Michaela held the gift, surrounded by women who understood what it meant to rebuild your life from ashes, she thought about the journey that had brought her here. The devastating diagnosis, Mateo's cruel abandonment, the long months of fighting alone, the gradual discovery of her own strength, and finally, the gift of David's patient love. Tomorrow she would marry a man who had loved her through uncertainty, who had never tried to fix her because he understood she wasn't broken. A man who saw her cancer not as a flaw to overlook but as part of the story that had made her who she was. Sometimes the best love stories aren't about finding someone to complete you, they're about finding someone who celebrates how complete you already are. Subscribe for more stories about love that heals, supports, and empowers. And remember, you are worthy of a love that shows up when things get difficult, not one that runs away. Michaela placed the plaque among Linda's tulips, where it would remind her every morning that she had not just survived the worst thing that ever happened to her. She had used it to build the most beautiful life she could have imagined. Standing in her garden at sunrise, surrounded by love and flowers and the promise of tomorrow, Michaela Johnson had never felt more grateful to be exactly who she was. If Elena's story touched your heart, if it reminded you that you deserve a love that stays through storms rather than runs from them, then hit that subscribe button right now. Share this story with every woman who needs to remember her worth. And tell me in the comments, what would you plant in your garden of new beginnings? Your support means everything to me, and I can't wait to bring you more stories of love that heals, empowers, and transforms. Until next time, remember that sometimes losing everything is the only way to find out what you're truly worth. Thank you so much for watching.